So what we're going to be talking about today is contextual interference. Now, you all may have experienced this. In fact, if you've come to a Practiclass, you've almost certainly, it is rare I don't use some sort of contextual interference in class, though we do other things as well. You may know this as something like rhythms or dotted rhythms. I think many of us have been advised at some point in our learning that we're playing something, we're repeating it, right? We rep it. We talked last week about the neuroscience of learning, how repetition builds myelin on neural networks. And don't worry if you weren't here last week, you don't have to know this, but how repetition builds myelin on neural networks. And what everybody knows, even if you weren't here last week, that by repeating something over and over, it becomes better. But we also know that we keep doing that and it stops getting a lot better at some point, doesn't it? Maybe we figure something out and it works a little bit, but we just can't seem to get past that plateau. Well, sometimes we've been advised, I know many students have, to try different rhythms. And we've tried a dotted rhythm or groups of 3 or something like that. And it works a little bit and it's wonderful, right? We're like, this is great. And then we do it again and it works less. And then we do it again and it works less. And then we try something else and it works even less. That's because what worked, what made it better, was not the dotted rhythms. What made it better was the difficulty that the dotted rhythms created. When I first discovered that things like dotted rhythms helped me get better, I learned to play everything. This is probably 15 years ago. I learned to play everything with dotted rhythms. I couldn't believe how well it worked because it was the first time I had done it. Then I started learning new music and I started doing that and I wondered why I couldn't get it. It would help up to a certain point and I wonder why it didn't work. It took me a couple of years to find the answer. In fact, when I'm on the road and I'm teaching at different schools, I've noticed this is something very prevalent for some reason in the northeast of the United States. I say to people, you know, we'll be in a Practiclass, we'll be live in front of people at some school somewhere, and I'll say, now, what have you done to make this better? Have you tried playing different rhythms? Yes, I have. I've done rhythms. I've heard the word rhythms used as a generic term for doing this. And I'll say, okay, show me. And they'll just whip through a dotted rhythm, whip through a reverse dotted rhythm, do groups of 3, and then some other rhythm. It's almost the same thing every time. And then say, see, I did it. It didn't really help. Of course it didn't. You're used to doing that. It's easy now. The idea is to interfere with the context. This makes our learning much more powerful. We are no longer being given a fish. Here, do a dotted rhythm. We now know how to fish. Oh, I need to find a rhythm that makes it difficult. What makes it difficult is something called contextual interference. We are taking something that we have learned and repped, and it's hit a point we can't get any better at it, and we are interfering with the context in which we play it. How simple can this be? There's research that shows 2 people studying for a math test, and you put them in 2 different rooms. One person studies in one room, the other does the studying in one room, and then another room. Same amount of time, just 2 different rooms. Consistently, the 2 different rooms get better grades, just because you varied the context. It makes you focus a little harder. When your cues are different, it makes you slightly uneasy. Anything that makes us focus harder helps us learn better. We talked about building neural networks last week. The part of your brain that builds neural networks is called the nucleus basalis, and it is turned on after the age of 13 by focus. That's how it's turned on. So the deeper we focus, the better we are at building these connections. So contextual interference creates difficulty for this focus. Now, this is a great quote from a researcher in this area at UCLA, he and his wife, Robert and Elizabeth Bjork. This is from a podcast, which is just wonderful. And I love this quote. And let's really take this to heart because it's even deeper than it may seem at first. The basic problem learners confront is that we can easily be misled as to whether we are learning effectively and have or have not achieved a level of learning and comprehension that will support our subsequent access to information or skills we are trying to learn. We can be misled by our subjective impressions. Let me explain that in a way we'll understand. If we do a couple of reps, we expect that the 5th one should be better than the first one, and the 10th one should be better than the 5th one. We expect that next day after warm-up, we should be better, or at least 2 days later, or something like that. If we actually get worse at something, if we play something and we get worse at it, what do? We think something is wrong. We need to go in and fix it. Now, this is true in the early stage when we're first learning something and building neural networks. But once we start to hit that plateau, we actually want to make it more difficult. And it will look to us like we're doing something wrong. In fact, we can actually, how many times have you said in a lesson or on stage, I played it better at home? How many times have you said that? Right? That is because you weren't done learning and you didn't realize it. We'll talk more about this when we get to spacing and retrieval practice, because that's really exciting about this. But the first part of memory is encoding. We haven't done the encoding as well as we could. So, what we are trying to do through contextual interference is not play different rhythms, is not do anything but create desirable difficulty. As Bjork describes it, making things good on yourself, but making things hard on yourself, but in a good way. Okay? The most important things to know: research shows that struggling through something after we have initially learned it improves that thing significantly in shorter periods of time. Faster, cleaner, better articulation, and easier to play. If you're doing dotted rhythms and you blow through it in 1 or 2 attempts, that's fine. Good that you did it. You're done. It's no use to you anymore. Go find something that makes you stop and think and make mistakes. That's right. Mistakes are our friends. They are not only pieces of information that show us what we need to work on, they are something we want to definitely put into our playing to force us to struggle to get to a new level. Mistakes are our friends. As Mimi Zweig says, a mistake is simply a piece of information. Sorry, I went backwards there. Okay, so there's something in learning called the power law of practice that researchers have noticed. What you're seeing here is a graph representing reaction time. That is, the quicker your reaction time, the better you've learned something. When you first do repetitions, you see the reaction time is very long. 1.8 seconds, a little bit more. And look how the reaction time goes down. It means we're learning more and more and more, and then look what happens. It tails off. You get less and less benefit from every rep that you do. This has been called the power law of practice because I don't know a lot about math, but it's called a power function in math, where something goes down the same amount of percentage each of the previous, each one that repeats after it. In other words, it gets less and less and less effective, more and more so all the time. And you can see it on the graph here. Just for anyone whose head is in this stuff, yes, there is an argument that it's not a power function, but an exponential function. You can go read the papers, whatever. They all show the same thing, that it does go down and level off at a certain time. I happen to use the power law of practice because it works. So, what can we do? By varying elements of whatever it is we are trying to improve, we create desirable difficulty and accelerated learning. So it'll get worse before it gets better, and you'll see how, and there are a lot of videos on my YouTube channel as well showing this. So the goal is to create struggle. It will feel frustrating, and we might feel like we can't do it. We will likely feel like we don't want to do it and want to quit. This is where the idea of mindset is important. It is in the effort to work through the task that high efficiency learning occurs. I want to say that again. It is in the effort to work through the task, to figure it out while you're doing it. When it looks like you're not learning, that is where the learning actually is. That's where talent hides, in those places. Mistakes are not to be avoided, but to be desired, then corrected. Think of how many people would put up with this type of thing. The few that know about it and do it regularly seem talented and gifted. Isn't it worth 10 to 20 minutes of struggle to see if it works? I have noticed rather unscientifically, how many people do we think in the world have talent? 3%? 5%? That's about how many are willing to do this stuff. I think there's a correlation. I don't know. I haven't done the research, but I think there is. Some of you will remember this image from last week. This is the brain learning a task. Do you see how involved the prefrontal cortex is? That forces you to do things you don't want to do. And, oh, this isn't fun. Where do I put the information? Here's what you do when you reset the power law. You take this and go all the way back to this. And you have to go through the learning and the encoding process again, so the encoding's even stronger. Then you bring it back here. I'm going to tell you right now, this is frustration. This doesn't feel all that great. This is what we want. And I'll finish by talking about something a Russian psychologist named Vygotsky calls the zone of proximal development. This is not how he represents it. I took this representation from the book Talent is Overrated, but it is related to what it's based on what Vygotsky talks about. So we have the comfort zone where we're all comfortable. That's where we all want to be. We're hanging out. We don't feel like practicing. Or if we're practicing, we'd rather play some stuff or do a few reps without thinking about it. And that's our comfort zone. Then there's the learning zone. That's where things are difficult. That's where we have to figure stuff out. In fact, Vygotsky says for the learning zone, we need a more knowledgeable other. That would be a teacher or a parent. What you do with desirable difficulty is you go on the very edge of the learning zone where you don't need the teacher anymore, but you still can't figure it out. That little area where you can figure it out, and that's what we do with the rhythms and different things, that little area where you can figure it out, and you keep putting yourself in it. Now, the panic zone is where the material is too difficult for you to learn. If you're just getting done learning Twinkle, you're not going to play a Paganini Caprice. I do not care. Yes, I don't believe in talent the way and all that stuff, but there is something for sequential instruction and for having the right basis to do the next thing. The panic zone is where, I'm sorry, no matter how hard you try, if you're just figuring out division, you can't do calculus. It's just not going to happen. It will happen someday, but it's not going to happen there. The art of teaching is keeping a student within the learning zone. The reason you hate some teaching is because it's forcing you in the learning zone. You see, the teacher is trying to keep you in the learning zone and you want to stay in the comfort zone. When I say you, I mean the entire human race. This is how we all function. Okay? And we all have to learn to embrace the learning zone. You read books, stretch yourself if you want to get better. Well, what the heck does that mean? It means going into that zone, and guess what? Desirable difficulty does that for us. It's almost like a button we can press. Instead of wondering, am I stretching myself? Oh, press the button. I'm going to try a new rhythm or something different. So that is desirable difficulty.